Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au. Continuing my series on locations around Australia where prices are rising strongly, seeking to debunk the myth that's gained some prevalence in mainstream media that prices are pretty much falling everywhere and there's no growth left in property markets anywhere in Australia. Simply isn't true. There's lots of locations, as I keep saying, where prices are still rising and in many cases rising very strongly. So tonight I want to focus on Victoria, in particular parts of Melbourne and regional areas close to the city. According to some research sources, and media loves to publish generalised statements about Melbourne property prices are falling or rising by a certain percentage point, usually quoting CoreLogic figures. They're not the only source of data that's out there, and when you look at multiple sources you realise what's happening with Melbourne prices isn't simply the facts according to the way media presents information. The latest figure from CoreLogic, the generalised figure that describes the whole of the Melbourne metropolitan area, says that Melbourne house prices in annual terms are down about 4.5%. But SQM research figure says there's basically no change when we compare the median price today with 12 months ago, whereas the latest figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics record an annual rise of 2.6%. So it isn't a fact, indeed, to say that Melbourne house prices are falling. Now, what can be said with some confidence is that the rate of growth has certainly wound back from where it was 1 year ago and 2 years ago. But some sources still have Melbourne on average as a generalisation above where they were 12 months ago. And all three sources I've just mentioned, the Bureau of Statistics, CoreLogic, SQM Research, they all have Melbourne apartment prices higher than they were 12 months ago. In the case of CoreLogic and the ABS, not much higher. In the case of SQM Research, 7% higher. So apartment prices holding up pretty well according to those numbers, those three different sources. House prices, depending on who you believe, are stagnating, falling a little, or rising a little. But the important thing is to segment information and look at individual sub-markets, because it's ridiculous to talk about Melbourne as a single market, even more ridiculous to talk about Australia as a single market, as many economists do. Even Melbourne as a single market doesn't make any sense. How can you compare Toorak and some of the swanky suburbs of the inner southeast with somewhere like Epping in the far north or Cranbourne way down in the far southeast? Totally different markets. They're not doing the same thing. So what we know to be true, because I did some detailed research on this recently, because I had an interview with ABC Radio in Melbourne, and I wanted to have current information and to make the point that there are still markets which are rising strongly in Melbourne and in areas just outside Melbourne. So if we look at the outer ring suburbs of the Melbourne metropolitan area, still very, very high price growth in annual terms. Up in the northern suburbs, the outer ring suburbs to the north, Lakeshore, Thomastown, South Morang, they're all up 14, 15, 16%. Jacana is up 17%. Epping, the suburb of Epping, is up 22% in annual terms, and Broadmeadows is up 26% in annual terms. So these are the exceptional markets that are not performing according to those averages that get published constantly in the media. And what's significant there is in the last 3-month period, which figures are many of those locations have had further significant growth. Broadmeadows, for example, has grown a further 3.5% in the last quarter. Epping's up another 2.5%. So growth still happening in those markets. Now, if you go down in the southwest, heading down towards Geelong, the city of Wyndham, a number of the suburbs there have also recorded very strong growth in the last 12 months. So Wyndham Vale, Werribee, Hoppers Crossing, they're all up in annual terms 18 to 19% compared to where price levels were a year ago. And Werribee in the last quarter has risen a further 3.1%. Wyndham Vale, similar. So those markets still growing strongly, including in the last quarter. But in particular, when you look at it in annual terms. Now, we'll go just outside the Melbourne metropolitan area into Geelong. Geelong's been getting a bit of media as an outstanding growth market. And Domain recently published a figure that said that the median price for the city of Greater Geelong had risen, let me just find the figure, 12.1% in the last 12 months. But individual suburbs have done much, much better than that, particularly the cheaper ones. Now, this is all about the search for affordability. What we know to be true from other research is that first home buyers are particularly active. In fact, across the nation, first home buyers are more active, doing more buying and borrowing more money than at any time in the last 8 years. There's been a 30% rise in the last 12 months in loans to first home buyers, and in Sydney, there's been a 74% rise in 12 months. That's amazing growth. And it's particularly happening, ironically, in our two most expensive cities, Sydney and Melbourne, helped by incentives and concessions from state governments in Victoria and New South Wales. So people out there buying in the affordable areas, not just first home buyers, and other people on budget, investors wanting to buy affordably, they're all boosting those markets on the fringe of the Melbourne metropolitan area. And then when we go beyond that into the city of Greater Geelong, it's the cheaper suburbs, the ones with the lower median house prices, that have had amazing growth in the last 12 months. For example, Geelong, North Geelong is up 24%, Herne Hill is up 24%, and in particular, the suburbs of Norlane and Corio. Those are not only probably the most affordable suburbs in the city of Greater Geelong, but they're the ones that are closest to central Melbourne. They both have median prices around 330, 350,000. In the last 12 months, their median prices have risen 30%, but still affordable by Melbourne standards. And again, in the last quarter, the last 3-month period for which we have figures, Corio has risen a further 7%, so is North Geelong, and Norlane's up 9% in 3 months. So the growth is still happening in these areas. Again, not true to say that Melbourne prices are falling, and it's not true to say that property prices are falling everywhere. These markets are showing exceptional growth. There are other places in Victoria close to the Melbourne metropolitan area also showing exceptional growth. If you go just outside of Melbourne, down in the far southeast, you encounter locations such as Pakenham. It's up 20% in annual terms. Then you come to Officer, the town of Officer, where median price is up 27%. And a little bit further out to Warragul, its median price in the last 12 months has risen 25%. And all of these locations I've just mentioned, Pakenham, Officer, Warragul, and also Druin, not far from Warragul, they've all shown growth around 4% in the last quarter. So these are examples of markets that are still very strong. Prices are still rising in annual terms. The growth is phenomenal. There are other places around Australia where similar things are happening. I'm not going to cover all of those places tonight. This is part of a series where I'm going to be presenting information on those places where the market's still strong and prices are rising, contrary to that very bad, unbalanced, blatantly inaccurate reporting we're seeing in mainstream media and newspapers like The Australian, for example, where they're telling us that property prices are falling across Australia. It's rubbish, and these figures, in part, prove that they're wrong. These are figures that I've quoted, which come from, which is the source that is most often quoted by newspapers like The Australian. So in coming days, I'll present more information for other locations around Australia. The information I've just presented on the fringe areas of Melbourne and also near Melbourne regional areas, I write more extensively about that in my weekly column on the Property Observer website. So if you'd like to see more information or actually sit down and read the information I've just presented, later in the week, my weekly column on Property Observer will appear probably on Wednesday or Thursday, and you can read in more detail about those locations in and around Melbourne that are still growing very strongly. That's it for now. I'll do this again really soon and speak to you about some other areas that are doing particularly well with their price growth at the moment. That's it for now. Terry Ryder signing off. Talk to you again soon.